Hello, this is Joe Romo with the Columbus Symphony Orchestra's Know the Score, hosted by Maestro George Del Gobo. This episode of Know the Score will focus on our upcoming concert, Vivaldi in Venice. Please enjoy this week's edition of Know the Score.
Hello and welcome to the first edition of Know the Score before the first concert of our 2021-22 season. We're very happy to see you all, and we hope that soon we'll be able to see you in person for these sessions. I should explain perhaps what we're up to in terms of concert planning. When we were planning this season back in the springtime, we were very suspicious of what might happen with the Delta variant of the coronavirus, and that it might have some sort of negative effect on our ability to present concerts at all. So we decided to take a very conservative tack and plan concerts at the beginning of the season that don't require a full orchestra. A small ensemble, much like we did last spring, that we can put on the stage and be masked and socially distanced properly so that the risk of infection to our players and to the audience is minimized. And so for that reason, we are starting this season with a concert of the music of Antonio Vivaldi, in which we use a chamber orchestra. And as the season goes on, we will increase the size of the orchestra gradually, and we hope that by the end of the year, in the springtime, we'll be able to play with a full orchestra and maybe even do away with masks and let our audience be more comfortable and not so socially distanced in the hall. But right now, putting 75 people on the stage, there's no way we can get them far enough apart to ensure their safety. So we're starting with Vivaldi. Antonio Vivaldi was one of the great Italian Baroque composers. He was born in Venice in 1678, I think it is the year, and lived much of his life in Venice. There is a lot of uncertainty about his birth, but perhaps the most interesting story is that he was born during an earthquake. And his mother was so fearful that he might not survive that she had him baptized immediately and dedicated him to the church. He did survive, and he was baptized again a few months later, but the dedication to the church remained. And when he was 15 years old, he began to study for the priesthood, and 10 years later, he was ordained a priest. Meanwhile, he was studying music, lessons with his father mainly, but also others, and became one of the most gifted, accomplished violinists of his time. In addition to being a composer, an impresario, a teacher, he could do anything when it came to music. Upon graduation from the seminary and assuming holy orders, he went to work almost immediately for an orphanage called the Hospital of the Pieta. Pieta is a word in Italian that has kind of two meanings. One is pity and one is piety. But we associate the word Pieta most commonly with the art and statues of the late Renaissance, in which Pieta is a representation of the Virgin Mary holding the body of the crucified Jesus. And the most famous one of those is perhaps the one in the Vatican, that if you go at the right time of the year, you can actually get close to. But otherwise, you're going to be in a horde of 1,000 tourists trying to get a look at it. It's one of Michelangelo's most famous statues, and rightfully so. But that's what that hospital was called, and it was basically an orphanage for abandoned and unwanted children. And they took all children. There was a lot. It was supported by the city of Venice for the most part. Boys were taught a trade, and at the age of 15 or so, they were sent out into the world to practice what they had learned. Girls were taught mostly music. That is the group in this orphanage with which Vivaldi worked for almost 30 years and for which he wrote much of his best music, both instrumental and vocal. People who heard these girls perform were uniformly astonished by how accomplished they were, both as singers and instrumentalists. And a lot of that had to do with the work of Antonio Vivaldi. He lived most of his life in Venice, as I said, and only left periodically to take on jobs at other places, but always returned until finally, near the end of his life, after he had met the Emperor Charles VI, I think it was, who professed to like his work very much, he decided to move to Vienna so he could be near the emperor in the hope that he could get support and obtain a position at the royal court. Unfortunately, the emperor died almost immediately upon Vivaldi's arrival, and then Vivaldi himself became ill, passed away several months later. So that the Viennese episode was not a happy one, to say the least. He was buried in a common grave in Vienna. It's a grave that is now lost. No one knows exactly where it is. He died in poverty, like so many composers and artists. And that was the end of kind of a sad end of a wonderfully creative and productive life. We have chosen to emphasize in our concert the concerto. Vivaldi wrote perhaps as many as 500 concertos. There are critics like Igor Stravinsky who said famously that Vivaldi didn't write 500 concertos, he wrote the same concerto 500 times. It's not quite that bad. There's a lot of similarity, certainly between and among the works. You can't write 500 of anything and not have some similarities that run through the output. But most of these concertos are remarkably inventive and creative and tuneful, and we have chosen, we think, the best ones for you to hear. We're going to begin the concert and intersperse in the middle two are what are called Sinfonias. Vivaldi also wrote a large number of these. The Synfonia is a form that grew out of the Italian opera overture at the time and became a form that had three sections. They were fast, slow, and fast. And the Sinfonia, that format, became the dominant format in Italian instrumental music, and indeed in a lot of instrumental music throughout Europe during the Baroque period. Eventually, it kind of morphed into the symphony. As the form developed and changed, it became more sophisticated. So in a way, Vivaldi was one of the earlier symphonists in that he composed a number of these pieces. You're going to hear two of them. The first one is the Sinfonia in G major that was performed at a special concert at the orphanage for royal visitors. And of course, they rolled out the red carpet and the girls performed admirably, and Vivaldi and others provided new music for this concert, and the scores were bound handsomely and presented to the royal visitors as a token of appreciation and I suppose in the hope of support from them. This Sinfonia, as I said, is in three parts, a fast part, a slow part, and another fast part. It's very, very joyful and exuberant. And I think that's a hallmark of Italian Baroque music. It's like letting the sun in. It's by and large joyous, happy music. It is very transparent music. The textures are not thick and complicated. There's not as much counterpoint as you would encounter, say, in the music of Bach, so that it's very easy to hear all of the parts and to follow all of the parts. And that is true in this piece. A unique aspect of the piece, in the second movement, the melody, it's a very simple melody, is doubled by an equal number of strings, of violins, playing pizzicato. So you have half the violin section playing arco with the bow and half plucking strings on the same melody, which provides a wonderful effect. And Vivaldi was known for experimenting and trying different things. The other Sinfonia is called Al Santo Sepolcro, at the Holy Sepulchre, And it was written for a church in Turin, Italy, that had built and was in the process of building a chapel that was a minimized, if you will, smaller replica of the church in Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was supposedly the church that's on the site where Jesus was buried. And as you can imagine, with a title like that, with a reference to the burial of the crucified Jesus, this is a very somber piece of music. It's very brief, and it is in only two movements. Slow and a little faster. There is no fast movements. It's a stark composition without any keyboard, without continuo, which is very unusual in music of the Baroque. The keyboard tends to supply not only rhythm and a bass line, but it also provides harmony, fills out the harmonies. And that doesn't happen in this Sinfonia. The harmony is very unstable and very chromatic, which is supposedly represents the suffering and the passion of Christ. It's a very moving sinfonia and something very unusual. I just said that Vivaldi's music is like letting the sun in, but in this case, in this particular piece, he is meditating on the death of Christ. So those sinfonias start the concert and are in the middle. And around them, we have grouped a number of concertos. As I said, Vivaldi wrote about 500 concertos. About 230 or so of these are for violin, which you would expect as he was a violinist. But he wrote for almost every instrument that was in common usage at the time. The first one, I'm not sure if this is the right order or not, but there's a concerto for Piccolo. And we imagine a piccolo in a modern symphony orchestra as an instrument that is used when power and volume is needed at the very high end of the orchestral texture, very often doubling the first violins in very high passages, very loud passages. You don't hear a lot of soft piccolo playing because it just isn't used that way. In the time of Vivaldi, that particular piccolo, the one you see in the orchestra that's about this long and looks like a miniature flute, did not exist. Metal flutes did not exist at all. We're talking about recorders here. And so this particular concerto was written for the smallest recorder, the sopranino recorder. And obviously, there aren't a lot of, there are, I suppose, a lot of sopranino recorder players, but we have chosen to have our piccolo player present this piece to you, and it is played a lot by people who employ the modern piccolo. And again, it's a fast, slow, fast kind of piece, and the fast movements are in what is called a ritornello form, and ritornello simply applies to the fact that what you will hear is the orchestra make a short statement, and then the soloist will come in and make a contrasting statement, and then the orchestra will repeat their opening statement, and the soloist will come in with something else. And that alternation between a main theme and contrasting episodes by the solo instrument is what is meant by the ritornello form. And that is true of the first and last movement of this piece. The second movement is a very beautiful, slow movement for the piccolo. And I think you'll be happy to hear the piccolo in an entirely different light. And an entirely different kind of usage. I for many years, when I was a player, I had to sit as a second violinist very near the piccolo. And I have to tell you, the piccolo can be the loudest, most penetrating instrument ever. And if you have to sit next to one, it can really hurt. So it's nice to hear the piccolo used in a little more approachable, subtle way, not necessarily aiming for power, but aiming for style and making beautiful music. Not that it isn't beautiful when it's played in an orchestra, it's just a whole different function. next concerto is one for two trumpets. Vivaldi did not write many brass concertos, and this is the only one that he wrote that employs trumpets. Probably he did that because the trumpet of his day was a very primitive instrument and did not have valves, pretty much, and was basically just a tube that was coiled up, and a mouthpiece was put in one end and a bell flared out on the other end, and the trumpet player was on his own. He could play any notes that he could make with his embouchure, with his lips. Because of the overtone series and the way that air inside the trumpet vibrates, the only time that a trumpet player could play notes that were adjoining, like to play a scale, were very high up in the overtone series. So a lot of Baroque trumpet playing that you hear will be extremely high. And this was very treacherous, especially in those days without valves. Even today, when players who aren't playing on original instruments but are playing modern instruments try to play these parts with valves on their trumpets, it can be very treacherous and very difficult. So you can imagine the challenge facing these trumpet players. But Vivaldi was interested enough to give us a concerto for two trumpets. They alternate and work together. The form is similar to what the form was in the Piccolo concerto. Everything is fast, slow, fast, 3 sections, ritornello. And it's if Vivaldi wasn't going to write more than one trumpet concerto, he gave us a good one. The next concerto is the guitar concerto, which was actually written for lute, but is played very often on guitar, on acoustic guitar these days. Again, it's a 3-movement piece in ritornello form, fast, slow, fast. The guitar fits really well with the strings. The slow movement is a very meditative, beautiful movement in which the guitar sort of muses over sustained strings. The last movement is a tarantella type piece in 12/8 that kind of gallops along at that pace and that rhythm. Again, a wonderful piece for guitar or lute if you are a purist. And finally, we are going to play one concerto from the Four Seasons, and we've chosen to play Autumn. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure that there was any particular artistic reason for that. I could say, well, it is autumn, but that would be kind of lame. But it's all of those concertos, each one of them is a wonderful piece. And the Four Seasons represent Vivaldi at his finest, at his best. They are very much programmatic in nature. Actually, there are sonnets that go with each one of the concertos describing what is happening in the music. And Vivaldi even went so far as to write in the score, here a dog barks, here flies are buzzing, here a creek flows, here there are drunken people, and so on. You get a little insight into what he was thinking and how his sound representations reflect the words of the sonnet that he is setting. There's a little bit of question about whether the sonnets came before or after the music, but that is the way it is with all Baroque music. No one really knows for sure a lot of things about it. Anyway, the Autumn Concerto takes place around harvest time, so there's a lot of celebrating in the first movement, a lot of gaiety, a lot of dancing, a lot of drinking, and gradually the crowd becomes inebriated and they fall into a sleep, which is the second slow movement that is very sustained and quiet. And then the third movement is a hunting movement. So the figures in the orchestra represent the chase and the hounds and the horses and all of that. It's a wonderful piece for violin and orchestra, and we hope that you will enjoy that. Vivaldi's music, after his death in Vienna, kind of disappeared. As with a lot of Baroque composers, their music was written in many cases for specific performances, and when those performances were over, the music was put aside, sometimes to be used again later in some form for something else, but often just laid aside and forgotten. And in Vivaldi's case, that certainly happened, plus the fact that styles were changing and we were going into the classical period, and interest in music of the Baroque period, even of giants like Bach, waned and was relatively, in Vivaldi's case, his music lay dormant for almost 150 years. And it wasn't until the beginning of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, that his music began to be rediscovered. And it has been discovered in all sorts of places, piled up in church basements and libraries and everywhere. So there's a constant effort to find Vivaldi's music and to put it together in some kind of order that makes sense. So we hope you enjoy this evening of Vivaldi. We are very happy to present it to you, and just playing this music makes us feel good, and we hope it makes you feel good too. Thank you so much. See you at the concert.
We hope you enjoyed this week's edition of Know the Score. If you are interested in supporting the CSO or purchasing tickets, please visit our website, csoga.org.